I am not Josie Hale. I'm Susan Lenfestey. I'm a Loft board member, and I'm pinch hitting for Josie, who is out of town. When I agreed to do this, I didn't realize I'd be preaching to the choir and looking around. I think I'm meeting with the deacons or something. This is like some Loft heavies here. I'm going to tell you 3 things. First, please turn off any cell phones or anything that would beep or buzz and disturb people. Secondly, I am instructed to tell you about the Loft, which again, looking around, I think most of you probably know, but the Loft is the largest and most comprehensive literary center in the country, as befits the most literate and book-friendly region in the country. We offer services for writers and readers at every level, every genre, from memoir, graphic novels, spoken word, children's programs. It is a happening, hip-hop, vibrant place, and it's thriving, thanks to all of you. Coming up in November, we have reading by Pam Houston, who's also keynoting the Novel Writing Conference. That's on November 5th. Also readings by Lee Herrick, Marge Barrett, Joanne Esser, and Jill Breckenridge, who's here. On November 11th, the Loft's Mentor Series readings kicks off with a reading by visiting creative nonfiction mentor Dinty Moore. Really? I looked him up. He has a great-looking memoir called Between Panic and Desire, which are the names of 2 towns where he lives. There are other great readings and education offerings coming up, so you can find information on our website, loft.org, or by talking to any member of the staff out in the Commons afterwards. There's information on the tables. And while you're doing that, we'd encourage you to become a member of the Loft, which you can be a sustaining member for as little as $5 a month. Does this sound like NPR pledge? And you will be part of something that really does put our city on the planet. So I hope you'll really look at that, and whatever you can do is considered a contribution. It makes you a member, and we'll hope you'll sign up for the Loft if you weren't one of the founders of the Loft. Finally, number 3, the Loft is thrilled to be collaborating with George Roberts' Downstairs Press, Homewood Studio, to bring you this reading by the contributors to Bringing Gifts, Bringing News, 50 poems, 5 lines each. By the way, I did not get the 5-line memo. Many of them, of course, are longtime supporters of the Loft, as I said. But finally, and I was not asked to say this, but I wanted to, a few words about George Roberts. He's a poet, a painter, a letterpress printer, a former teacher at North High School, also the father of one of our daughter's classmates about a quarter century ago or more. He and his wife Bev have lived in the Homewood neighborhood of North Minneapolis for nearly 40 years. When he was ready to retire from teaching, he bought a building on the north side and converted it to studios to be rented out, including one for himself, his own Homewood studio. He didn't do this to make a buck or to flip it or because it was cheap. He did it, as he said, to give the neighborhood a sense of itself. And this always makes me cry. As he told NPR's Marianne Combs in 2006, and I quote, "They know this is a safe place. The kids in the neighborhood know they can come here. They know that the art changes regularly, so there will be something to look at and talk about. I always ask them to go around and pick out their favorite one, and then tell me why it's their favorite one. And slowly then I try to teach them some language of art. I try to teach them about line or form or shape or color so that they can have something to say about the work of art and begin to feel good about themselves." It's an honor, and it makes me feel good to welcome George Roberts to this evening.
And it makes me feel good you're all here. I want to begin with the poem that gives the book its name. It's by Denise Levertov. It's from a poem of hers called Cloud Poems, and this is part 3, called The Cutting Beam. Imagine 2 neighboring hills and your house, my house, looking across, friendly. Imagine ourselves meeting each other, bringing gifts, bringing news. That's bringing gifts, bringing news, I think, was given to me, not at the beginning of this project, but told me that's what this book is about. It's about this community of poets that I've been privileged to be a part of for a half century. And the project was conceived with a sense of gratitude for that, conceived in the idea that I've been so lucky to have all of these poets be in my life, become my mentors, my beacons, my friends, my peers, my students, each one of them with a lesson for me about how to live the life of poetry. So during this project, I began to conceive of us as elements of the night in Van Gogh's Starry Night. Each of us poets, one of those wonderful, brilliant orbs whirling around in the sky, and each of us taking energy from all the rest of us and coming brighter and brighter and brighter. So this book is not at all a look at what the poetry scene in the Twin Cities has been for the last 50 years. It's those 50 poets who have touched me personally and given me my star in that starry night. But I know that Keith's star, or Nora's star, or Phoebe's star has other poets feeding them as well. So when you see this great community of whirling stars in the night, you know that each of us has 50 poets feeding us, some overlapping and some not. This book is then a gesture of thanks to you 50 poets who have allowed me to be the one standing up here talking about it. And there are some other thanks I'd like to do. I'd like to thank the Loft, of course, for being a wonderful partner in this project. It pretty much started with me coming over here and saying to Jared, there's some people I need to get a hold of. Do you have their email addresses? People I haven't seen, but I knew you were around. And he said, well, we can't do that. We can't give out email addresses, but give me the list. I'll get a hold of them and say you're looking for them. And that's how I contacted many of you. And all the way through, Jared and Lucas have been wonderful partners in making this evening happen. To my family and friends, I want to say thank you. And to the Northside Writers Group, who were there when it was time to fold all these pages that I had printed, or time to gather them into signatures or get them to the binders, to proofread. All of those things that don't show up in the book you're holding in any way that they get praise for. But they are part of the community and they deserve that praise as well. I want to say a special thanks to the poets who traveled further than a few miles to get here. Mark Vinz traveled from Moorhead. John Ruff traveled from northern Indiana. And others of you traveled a lot of distance to get up here for 5 minutes and to have me harp on you and say, no more than 5 minutes. I think you understand you're part of something bigger. And that's what we're doing here tonight, is celebrating that starry night that we all are. So thank you to you poets again. And finally, there's Beverly, who's been there the whole time, and I need to thank her. So the order of events, each of the poets will come up in alphabetical order, and I have invited them, in addition to their own poem, to choose a poem that says something about their inspiration to become a writer or to continue writing. So they'll read that poem, and then they'll read their own. They may have some comments too, and every one of them will observe our 5-minute rule, to be sure. Because we don't want you to leave here tonight thinking you've been at a Baptist revival for the last 6 hours and your glutes are dead. We don't want that. Afterwards, we'll adjourn again out into the hall where we'll have food and conversation until we're kicked out. But one last thing is to say that Larry Risser, a longtime friend and teacher and photographer, says, I think we need a photograph of this moment. So he and I would like to invite the poets right away to go out, and we'll assemble on the stairs going down, and he'll take a photo of us just like a wedding, he said. So let's let the feast begin with Zoey Bird.
George has been my teacher for over 20 years now, starting with my stint at North High School, which was only 4 years long, as opposed to 30. I can't tell you how honored this makes me to be here. And for me, there is no other way to say what I want to say than by reading a poem by George from Elfrida's Cat, his book of prose poems about teaching. Journals. You don't make art, you find it. Charles Simic, Dime Store Alchemy. No matter the class, no matter the grade, the weather, or the time of year, we begin each day by writing. Lights low, silence except for the ticking of the clock and the soft rasping of pens and pencils. 10 minutes at least of this exercise each day. As my students accept this routine, as they learn the ropes of this new skill, I can see them grow hungry for it. After a while, I no longer need to ask them to take out their journals and copy down the day's title. They do this by habit and begin to stir in their seats if the directions are too lengthy. Their lovely bodies bend closer and closer to the page as they write, connecting with a part of themselves they knew nothing about before snowflake-sized spallings from a cave painting in Central Africa, like the petrified wings of a dazzling prehistoric insect, began fluttering down from the ceiling. John, nearly blinded in 5th grade by a virus, writes about the day his Korean mother, tearfully putting him on a plane for America and for what she hoped would be a better life, sewed her picture into the lining of his trousers. I haven't thought about this much since then, since I was 4, he confides in the class before he reads. Somewhere in the middle of his reading, holding the journal page close to his eyes, he stumbles across the words, "I never cried about this," and surrenders to those long banished tears. We all sit stunned, paralyzed by what we are witnessing. Then Keisha, who just a few days ago risked reading about wishing she had known what it was like to have a father, gives John a Kleenex, rests her hand on his shoulder, and with the unschooled instinct of a Marie Curie or a Jane Goodall, reads her own day's entry. The turning of the earth and of the seasons, the drawing in of breath and the exhaling out again into the universe, the longing for crocuses at the end of winter. We live by rhythms, by cycles, and by the expectations these natural events quicken inside us. The classroom is no different than the rest of the world. It is the place we learn to be human. Thank you, George, for teaching me how I want to live. What a beautiful book. Home. Perfume equals 1 summer's catalpa blossoms. Add water in mason jars and leave to explode 1 block from the tracks. In the basement, drawing an avid dust to the red drain. The dirt floor opens and I find not Vivian's corpse, my family of hidden stones, folded awake in a delicate, shattering water.
I'm Jill Breckenridge, and I'm so honored to be part of this beautiful, beautiful book. I think we're all going to fight tears. I'm so touched by this, and I'm just going to talk through it. It's very embarrassing. But what George has done, the love he gave to make this book, and the time he put into it, and how beautiful it is. It's so inspiring. So thank you, George. I'll try not to weep through the whole reading. So the quote of the book, right in the beginning, the quote by Daniel Lenoir, is it? "We do what we do because we love someone else who did it first." And I think that's such a wonderful quote. And I spent much of the day today looking through Liesl Mueller's book, who was one of my mentors when I got my MFA. I was so lucky to have her. And I was hoping at that time to write a book-length poem about the Civil War. I just had a passion to do that. And everybody else at the MFA program, or whoever else I talked to that was in a position to know something, would say, "Why would you want to do that?" And Liesl said, "What a great idea. Go for it." So I spent much of the day reading this book of her poems and trying to decide which one to read, because I love so many so much. And this one is called Hope by Liesl Mueller. It hovers in dark corners before the lights are turned on. It shakes sleep from its eyes and drops from mushroom gills. It explodes in the starry heads of dandelions turned sages. It sticks to the wings of green angels that sail from the tops of maples. It sprouts in each occluded eye of the many-eyed potato. It lives in each earthworm segment, surviving cruelty. It is the motion that runs from the eyes to the tail of a dog. It is the mouth that inflates the lungs of the child that has just been born. It is the singular gift we cannot destroy in ourselves, the argument that refutes death, the genius that invents the future, all we know of God. It is the serum which makes us swear not to betray one another. It is in this poem, Trying to Speak. And then I'm going to read my poem called Summer Painting. I've just recently started painting and loving it, so it's interesting that this is the way the poem went. So it's called Summer Painting. A male goldfinch, gold body, black wings, sways on our feeder filled with black thistle seed, while across the road, goldenrod sways with the wind. Background for this gold and black painting. Thank you.
Good evening. This is an occasion for the ages. Just not the ages. Don't be cute now. For the ages, and I hope that when Larry takes the picture on the stairs, there's lots of fresh elastic in his camera, because it's going to be wonderful. Bravo to George. Amazing. And Jill used the word touching. It is a touching evening to see so many of you who I've known and loved for so long, and your poems, and to have this book, which is such a beautiful, if I may say the word, object. So I've been thinking about old timers, and thinking of some who've left us recently. Roy McBride, for example. Dear Roy, passed a few months ago. I went last week to the Walker with my son Peter, who's now almost 28, to see Jim Tate read. I met Jim in a Quonset hut in Iowa City when he was 21. And I was 26, and now he's laboring with illness and age, but there he was reading his poems, his distinctively strange poems. So I want to say one poem of the many I love. I want to say one in memory of John Engman, who a lot of us knew, old-timers, who died at 46. And when we heard he was ill in the hospital, some of us gathered there, and there he was in the bed, obviously not doing well and was not to do well. And a poem occurred to me, a short poem, I'll say you. And I love poems that occur to you in real-life situations, that articulate something that adds the resonance to the occasion. And this is a little poem by Edna St. Vincent Millay called To a Young Poet. Time cannot break the bird's wing from the bird. Bird and wing together go down one feather. No thing that ever flew, not the lark, not you, can die as others do. So we lose them, but they're with us. My little poem in this beautiful book It's called Your Hair. Little confession. I'll keep my 5 minutes limit. But George, I came to George's wonderful studio. What a great thing that is. And I set the type myself. George suggested I could do that. And George and I were both quite pleased, and I went home, and he contacted me and said, we left a word out. I mean, really. A significant word, too. I won't tell you which one. It's called Your Hair. I love your hair. I love how your hair shines. I love how your hair rose across the Atlantic.
Hi, I'm John Caddy. I love Michael's poem. I love how the shiny domes are gleaming in the lights here, all over the place. It's kind of fun. All my friends have lost their hair. I especially, if you can, get a good look at John Finn's head. It's just magnificent. Yes, it is. Where are you, John? You're back there somewhere. I very cleverly typed up and printed my poem with the poem by Theodore Rezmerski I was going to read, which is out there in the anteroom somewhere. I lost it. So I won't be reading that. Sorry to say. I think I'll try to say an Aesop poem, if I can. I have no memory left, so bear with me. A garden butterfly, the baby crawls. It flies, she crawls, the baby crawls. This is a very short poem. I was dismayed. You know, I've never written a 5-line poem in my life on purpose. And this guy, you know, who I've loved for many years, calls me up and says, write a 5-line poem. Whatever happened to the great English quatrain, George? But then I saw all the smart people did. They wrote long lines. That's impure. It never occurred to me. So I have become a dedicated observer of the natural world the last 20 years or so. And I want to read a very short poem. Off the trail, a yellow leaf spins on a spider silk. Spins without sound, blinks light, winks bright, twice each round.
I'm Marisha Chamberlain. This project with George has had an underlying undercurrent of thrill the whole way through. It was thrilling to be contacted. It was thrilling to grasp what the idea behind the project was and to be in such wonderful company. It was thrilling to set my poem also. Thank you, George. I chose a little poem by Louise Glick that's in the form of a letter. And because it's in the form of a letter, it can be hard to follow out loud, so I'm going to help you by just letting you know when the closing is. The salutation is one word, and I'll go like this when we get to the closing. It's called The Gift. Lord, you may not recognize me speaking for someone else. I have a son. He is so little, so ignorant. He likes to stand at the screen door calling Augie, Augie, entering language. And sometimes a dog will stop and come up the walk, perhaps accidentally. May he believe this is not an accident. At the screen door, welcoming each beast in love's name, your emissary. My poem in this represents a great love of mine, which is mushroom hunting. And if anybody else in here is a mushroom hunter, you'll know that it's been a great year for it. And in these 5 lines, you'll recognize 3 of the common edible mushrooms that grow in Minnesota. The mushroom hunter's haul, a sulfurous thunderclap burst from a log, a clutch of gray sails, the ship buried in rotten wood, a clutch of swollen buttons.
I'm Art Froehle, and I have the distinction of knowing George Roberts since we were in college together back in the 60s. And we both attended a reading by Brother Antoninus, which is what got George on his road to poetry. George, this is unbelievable. I've looked forward to this all day, to this reading. Some 30 years ago, I attended a Robert Creeley poetry reading. When he finished, I went up to thank him and comment on how I appreciated his terse, concise style, especially in his poem, Love Comes Quietly. As I was about to leave, he reached over to shake my hand. I took that small gesture as an invitation to continue writing my own poetry. Here is Creeley's poem. Love comes quietly. Love comes quietly, finely, drops about me, on me, in the old ways. What did I know, thinking myself able to go alone all the way? The next poem, my poem, came about as a result of going salmon fishing with 3 brothers, about 80 miles south of Nome, Alaska, driving down the tundra. A grizzly bear observed us, unbeknownst to us, by the way. In a similar way to this poem that I read, I was impressed 2 years ago by the many salmon I observed leaping completely out of the shallow water in a river south of Nome, Alaska, on their final triumphant quest, inspiring me to do likewise. A piscatory primer. To be like these Neakluk River salmon, goal-oriented, task-centered, no questions, absolutely no doubts. A fancy pirouette now and then, embracing death with no regrets.
I'm Natalie Goldberg, and it was so amazing to live in New Mexico and out of the blue get an email from George. And I couldn't not come up from Santa Fe. This is a wonderful thing you're doing, George. Everyone looks so beautiful and ageless. It's really great. And I also want to honor Minnesota and the Twin Cities, because this is really where I learned to write. And I thank you so much for that. And before I even thought I was a writer, but this is the poem that when George said, bring something that inspired you to be a poet, it was when I was in college. I realized it was a poem that at the time I don't think I was aware of it, me being a Jew and a Buddhist. It was a Christian poem that I read over and over again and tortured my roommates with. And only reading it now did I realize it's Christian. It just was so big for me. God's Grandeur by Gerard Manley Hopkins. The world is charged with grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men then now not wreak his rod? Generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can feet feel being shod. And for all this, nature is never spent. Their lives the dearest freshness, deep down things. And though the last lights off the black west went, oh, morning at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and with bright wings. I felt 20 again reading that. Sitting. Now we get closer to what I have known, a bare cushion, a still night, nothing moving but the mountains and the enormous sky. Thank you.
Well, like everyone else, I want to give thanks to George. It's very touching and just a wonderful project. And I'm delighted to be here as part of it. I was happy to see that some other people have been inspired by fish, like art. I was so happy to find a poem about fish very close to my own poem, which isn't quite about fish, but I'll explain that in a pedantic way in a moment. But first I'll read a poem which is, so far as I know, anonymous, but which I think must have inspired some of the fishy poems I did. I mean, you know, the real fishy poems, not the fishy poems where it looks like you cribbed from Eliot or something. So I was trying to think, you know, to sort of obey the command to read a poem that had some influence on your poetry. And I have written a lot about fish and water and other exciting things connected with those things. And I was trying to think of a fish poet that inspired me. That didn't have to do with anything connected with the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner or anything. And I thought of this. It's, I guess, anonymous, but somebody wrote it and they know who they are, or once did. And I came across it when I was about 11 years old, and it was in an outdoor magazine. I like to read outdoor magazines about fish and fishing. And in the middle of this magazine, there was always an ad. I think it was Outdoor Life. Could have been Field and Stream. We don't care too much about that, do we? But anyway, in the middle of the magazine, there was an ad for the Nash, which was labeled by the makers of the Nash as a sportsman car, and able in the luggage compartment to store 2 dead moose. So it was a sort of, you know, Sarah Palin mobile of its time. And the guy who used to write about this car, this Nash, which had, I'm part of the sportsman stuff, however you look at it, was that it had fold-down beds in it, besides the moose storage largesse. I think you probably wouldn't want to have those going at the same time. But nevertheless, there was this quote from this anonymous poet in one of the ads, which were always written by a man named Ed Zern, whom I thought was really a funny writer, and he always wrote about the Nash and its versatility. And one time he included this poem, which I think must have had some influence on some of my fishy poems. It goes like this. Of all the fishes in the sea, I like best the bass. He climbs amidst the rocks and trees and slides down on his hands and knees. And now for the lesser talent, that's me. My five-liner is called Mayfly Ontology. I'm a retired professor from the university as well as a non-retired poet. But ontology to a philosopher is very big, pretentious, kind of important to some, kind of not important to some. But it's a big shot term, and it has to do with sort of signifying the whole being and makeup of something. And this has to do with the being and makeup of a kind of fly that hatches once a year and then they die, but there's feeding frenzy and fish all over them and so on. So this is called speaking to its essential nature, and what it really is. Mayfly ontology. Being a mayfly is to make other mayflies on the lake.
My name is Phoebe Hansen. Was that a chortle I heard? Really funny. At the Funeral of Great Aunt Mary by Robert Bly. Here we are all dressed up to honor death. No, it is not that. It is to honor this old woman born in Bellingham, Minnesota, that is. The church windows are open to the green trees. The minister tells us that being the sons and daughters of God, we rejoice at death, for we go to the mansions prepared from the foundations of the world. Impossible. No one believes it. Out on the bare pioneer field, the frail body must wait until dusk to be lowered in the hot and sandy earth. And it was Robert Bly who, in his first book, Silence in the Snowy Fields, made me realize that I could become a poet, and not for any exalted reasons, but because there were so many western Minnesota place names in his poems. Bellingham, Marietta, Milan. You might think that should be pronounced Milan, but it's Milan. So that's what gave me encouragement. And from Robert Bly, I also have to thank him for another one of my favorite poems that influenced me greatly. It's by Lala. Robert was out having everyone read Rumi, and I thought there must be a female poet that's the equivalent of Rumi. So I found her in a Catholic monastery where I went for a little writing retreat. And the name of the book is Naked Song. She was a 14th century Kashmiri who had been abused by her husband, apparently, and traveled around Kashmir naked. This was not Minnesota. And here's the poem that has had a great influence on me. But I really found out about her because of Robert Bly. I never trusted it for a moment, but I drank it anyway, the wine of my own poetry. It gave me the daring to take hold of the darkness and tear it down and cut it into little pieces. And then there was this poem that has become very important to me. It reminds me of the days when Robert Bly used to read William Blake, accompanied by some little toy-like instrument. Do you remember those days? Did you ever go to any of those readings? He who binds to himself a joy does the winged life destroy. He who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. William Blake. And my poem in this book, which is so beautiful, it made me tear up, The Darkness. I decided also to add an additional rule. So not only to have 5 lines, which is very foreign to me because I usually write very long lines, but I also decided each line would have 5 syllables. Felt so smug when I decided to do that. The Darkness. 8 years old, I kneel on my mother's grave. Her white arms reach up, try to pull me down. I refuse to go.
Thank you, Phoebe. I'm Margaret Hasse. When I was a little girl, people read me poetry, and I just loved it. And I am so grateful that people are still reading poetry out loud. I read poetry quite a bit during my childhood and teenage life, but until I read the poem I'm going to read you tonight, I didn't really feel ignited to write poetry. This is a poem called The Graffiti Poet by the poet Nancy Willard. And when I read it, I'll read you the first 2 lines first, and I did excerpt it a little bit in the interest of fitting it in tonight. It begins, I grew up in the schoolrooms of the Dakotas. When I read that, I thought, I'm growing up in the schoolrooms of the Dakotas. The next line is, I sat by the wood stove and longed for spring. Well, I sat by radiators and I longed for spring. And the poem just spoke to me about my own experience. And for the first time, it wasn't somebody far away from me writing, but somebody writing right beside me, speaking in my ears. So here's The Graffiti Poet by Nancy Willard. I grew up in the schoolrooms of the Dakotas. I sat by the wood stove and longed for spring. My desk leaned like a clavichord stripped of its hammer, and on it I carved my name forever and ever, so the seed of that place should never forget me. Outside in their beehive tombs, I could hear the dead spinning extravagant honey. I remembered their names and only wanted that the living remember mine. On the Brooklyn Bridge, I wrote a poem, and the rain washed it away. From the hills of Newark to the shores of Detroit, I engraved my presence with fire so the lords of those places may never forget me. Save me, I can hardly speak, and so we pass not speaking. In bars where your dreams drink, I scrawl your name and my name in a heart that the morning daily erases. I saw my poem sucked into a single cry. Throw me a fistful of stars. I am lonely. More than any monument, I want you to see me writing. I love you, or I love someone. I live, or you live. Canny with rancor and with love, I teach you to spell. I remember your name and your epitaphs, which are always changing. Listen to me, stranger, keep me alive. I am you. Nancy Willard. Thank you. I did end up writing poems in high school. One of them, speaking of I'm lonely for spring, was called Spring is So Lonely Alone. And it was a little lugubrious, it was a little wet, but I did send it into the National Council of Teachers of English, and it was noticed. And I was on my way to writing career. One of the most dear times I've spent in the last few months, those 2 hours with George, setting type, as others have mentioned. And oh my goodness, is that a time-consuming, very careful craft and act, and also so delicious, but it made me want to write really short poems forever because it was so hard. Here's my really short poem, and with many thanks for everybody reading tonight, all of you being here, and for this project. Open window, 4 a.m. A cricket in the still dark of the stubbled lawn worries his corrugated wings beyond the bedroom of a watched child whose fever will break at dawn. Thank you.
My name is Roberta Hill. I was known by Roberta Hill Whiteman, and I'm very honored by George to have been involved and invited to contribute a poem. And I had a more serious poem to share until Mr. Gunderson came up. So I think I'm going to use the poem that was in a lighter mood. Both of them are by Theodore Radke, who was the professor who taught Richard Hugo, and Richard Hugo was my professor, my mentor. And it's a poem that I find, no matter what age we are, it just seems to infect us with the delight of language. And it's called Dinky. Oh, what's the weather in a beard? It's windy there and rather weird. And when you think the sky has cleared, why, there is dirty Dinky. Suppose you walk out in a storm with nothing on to keep you warm, and then step barefoot on a worm. Of course, it's dirty Dinky. As I was crossing a hot, hot plain, I saw a sight that caused me pain. You asked me before, I'll tell you again, it looked like dirty Dinky. Last night, you lay a-sleeping, no, the room was 45 below. The sheets and blankets turned to snow. He'd got in, dirty Dinky. You'd better watch the things you do. You better watch the things you do. You're part of him. He's part of you. You may be dirty Dinky. There's another poet who I dearly love and like to read, especially when I want to hear the music of poetry. He's a Spanish romantic poet by the name of Juan Ramon Jimenez. He has a very short poem that I like to think about, especially in these times. It goes, if you hurry, time, like a butterfly, will flee before you. If you linger, time, like an ox, will trudge behind you. So I'm going to read my poem. My father was a musician. He was a trumpet player and liked to play music. And when he was in World War II, he lost his teeth. And so he became a guitar player and a violinist. And he always would like to play music and had us learn to play music with him. And so music has been really much a part of my experience of writing. The poem is Music No Matter Where. Dreaming of places I've never been, forested mountain or steep beach at low tide, I do not wish to know who takes me, I ride. When voices begin singing, whether from rain or foam or flame and wind, I listen to these friends whose beauty wakes me, no matter where I am. Thank you.
My name is Laura Jean, and I was also a student of George's. He accepted me into his high school writing program for no good reason. I was a lazy, failing student. And in fact, before I tried to get into the writing program, I tried to get into the art program, but they rejected me because the art teacher knew I never completed anything. George took us on a lot of field trips. He spent his lunch hour schlepping us down to the old MCBA so that we could learn to make paper, set type, bind books. And he also took us to the Midway bookstore in St. Paul. We had to choose another student's name out of a hat, and we had to buy a book for that student. And Kyra Robinson bought me a book of Anne Sexton's poems. And it was the first poet I ever became obsessed with, morbidly obsessed with, which I think is fitting. And that tells you a lot about where I was at 16. There's a line in one of her poems that always comes back to me, and that is, "Need is not quite belief." And I spent a lot of time thinking about how that influenced my writing. It didn't exactly inspire me to write, but I think that writing fills that need for me. So I'm going to read, "With mercy for the greedy. For my friend Ruth, who urges me to make an appointment for the sacrament of confession. Concerning your letter in which you ask me to call a priest, and in which you ask me to wear the cross that you enclose, your dog-bitten cross, no larger than a thumb, small and wooden, no thorns this rose. I pray to its shadow, that gray place where it lies on your letter, deep, deep. I detest my sins, and I try to believe in the cross. I touch its tender hips, its dark-jawed face, its solid neck, its brown sleep. True, there is a beautiful Jesus. He is frozen to his bones like a chunk of beef. How desperately he wanted to pull his arms in. How desperately I touch his vertical and horizontal axes. But I can't. Need is not quite belief. All morning long I have worn your cross, hung with package string around my throat. It tapped me lightly as a child's heart might, tapping secondhand, softly waiting to be born. Ruth, I cherish the letter you wrote. My friend, I was born doing reference work in sin, and born confessing it. That is what poems are. With mercy for the greedy, they are the tongue's wrangle, the world's pottage, the rat's star. And then my poem, a poem for Etta. She sits at the edge of the bed. Firm bones, slouching jowls, and pearly white hair frame her picture. Still, there is a young woman in between the gentle lines, yielding slowly sideways, giving in to what is easiest, embraced by the soft bed, she sighs. Her eyes surrender too, lids falling shut, in relief to be home.
I do want to say that when George asked us to do 5 lines, and I figured you just write 5 long lines. That's how you get all you want in. He did not tell us about setting the type, though. So we were 3 hours, I think, together doing that. What an honor. What an honor to be here. I would like to read, I'm Julie Landsman, and I'd like to read one poem by a man named Adam Zagajewski, we think is how to pronounce his name. I'm not sure. The reason I want to read him is just simply that I didn't realize that you could write poetry about something going on in the world that you cared so deeply about, that wasn't as startlingly personal, that poetry could reach out into a much broader audience. And that's what he brought me. I think one of the first poems I read of his was after the towers were destroyed in New York And then I began going back and reading his poems. And actually, Jim Moore, who's here tonight, also encouraged my interest in this man. The poem is called Try to Praise the Mutilated World. Try to praise the mutilated world. Remember June's long days and wild strawberries, drops of rosé wine, the nettles that methodically overgrow the abandoned homesteads of exiles. You must praise the mutilated world. You watch the stylish yachts and ships. One of them had a long trip ahead of it, while salty oblivion awaited others. You've seen the refugees going nowhere. You've heard the executioners sing joyfully. You should praise the mutilated world. Remember the moments when we were together in a white room and the curtain fluttered? Return in thought to the concert where music flared. You gathered acorns in the park in autumn, and leaves eddied over the earth's scars. Praise the mutilated world, and the gray feather a thrush lost, and the gentle light that strays and vanishes and returns. I wrote a poem for my grandchild, who is now 2 years old. This was written when he was a baby. It's called Perhaps. Perhaps the wavering of your hands against the determined speed of the world, or our night walks accompanied by the planet's vanishing blue ice, or simply the way your fingers trace my eyelids as you drowse into a nap. Hint why I sing to you long after you sleep, brood over the flooding earth, all the time loving your hesitant steps through summer's green heat.
Hi, I'm Jim Lenfestey, and I was, of course, wanted to especially praise George's work all those years as a teacher at North High School, but I should have known that would be abundantly appreciated here. On October 6th, the Nobel Committee announced its award, which was for Tomas Tranströmer. The great celebration occurred, of course, in Sweden, where this has been anticipated for at least 10 years, and the press has camped outside his house for at least 10 years anticipating this. Well, as I hope you all know, a celebration occurs here as well, because Tomas Tranströmer's very best friend in the world outside of his wife is Robert Bly. And I want to announce something. The actual award is going to be given in Sweden to Tranströmer on the 10th of December. And on the 12th of December, a literary witness program at Plymouth Congregational Church, which I chair, is going to host a reading of Tranströmer's poems with, in the original Swedish by the retired Professor Emeritus at Gustavus Adolphus Roland, I'll give you I can't never remember his last name, a native speaker of Swedish, and the translations by Robert Bly will be read by Robert Bly. So I hope you will all come. This will be at 7 p.m. at Plymouth Congregational Church, a free event in honor of Tranströmer and this extraordinary friendship. The book of their correspondence is a huge hit in Sweden, and it will be published in America next year. So in light of that, I will do a poem by Robert Bly. It's a poem called Waking Up, and it is also you can only find it set in lead type, done in a book by Malia Press, Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson's Malia Press, who would be here if he were not in Washington State right now. Waking Up. When he wakes, a man is like the earth rolling over as it rolls at dawn, turning gradually jagged mountains and grasslands up to the fierce light of space. Second verse. Something in me remembered to breathe on as I slept all night. The breath protected me as the atmosphere around the earth protects the earth. Third verse. When I was a small boy, I liked to think I thought once it would be best to die. That would make everything better for others and knives flew around the house. Fourth verse, last verse. Waking up, I am like a soldier waking after a battle, his friends all dead, himself still alive. What do? I walk through the ditch grass, skirting the towns, asking in barns for fresh milk. And George, here's a gift for you. This is just published by the University of Minnesota Press. It's a tribute to Robert Bly. It's called Robert Bly in This World, and it's signed by Robert. And my 5-line poem is this. I wake in half moonlight. She pours out everything from her sideways cup. Light of today, yesterday, tomorrow at once. Notation on the calendar, timekeeper, tidal pull, phase change, moon in the middle, little celebrated, neither scalpel nor spatula nor sickle, nor bloody banner, nor sacrificial wafer, nor howling man, nor weeping woman. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Roseanne Lloyd, and it's just wonderful to be here and see people I've known but haven't seen in a long time, or people whose work I've read but have never actually met. And thank you, George. It's wonderful. George and I crossed paths when we both taught for Minneapolis Public Schools, and later we were in contact because I was going to teach his book called Scrut, which is a wonderful book of poems about adolescence. Do you still have copies? Yeah. Something to, okay. Wonderful, wonderful book that I've used teaching at the Loft. So, like others who have mentioned this, I'm not one to write short poems. So I was in quite a quandary, and it took me a really long time. But I turned to being reminded of who I call the queen of the short poem. And I'll read one of hers first. And some of you may know this poem, Lucille Clifton. Homage to my hips. Please say it with me if you know it. These hips are big hips. They need space to move around in. They don't fit into little petty places. These hips are free hips. They don't like to be held back. These hips have never been enslaved. They go where they want to go. They do what they want to do. These hips are mighty hips. These hips are magic hips. I have known them to put a spell on a man and spin him like a top. Thank you. Lucille's poems, cover the waterfront. They're big poems in a short space. So, as someone said, the lesser poet follows. Teaching at North High School, 1968, mini skirts and high heels. This is dedicated to Cy Yesner, who brought the first Poets in the Schools program to Minneapolis. And there were so many wonderful people who came that year or the next. Mari Evans, James Welsh. And it was just a thrill to have real poets come into our classrooms. But anyway, there I was, wearing high heels. Those sling-back black pumps, stilty gold sandals. I didn't reckon with my wobbly left ankle. 1,000 falls later, I walk with brace and cane. Lucky for me, my partner's a legman. He needs my thigh, my ankle and sole. Thank you.
I'm Michael Mann. My poem needs a little, or my presentation needs a little bit of self-effacement because, in fact, I wrote the poem that supposedly influenced me, but that that it had to do with a misunderstanding of the word influence. When I first heard the idea, what sprung to mind was the fact that I was engaged in a very interesting conversation with a Canadian poet named John Cary. And John is in the midst of a couple of years of trying to bring back the sound poem, and has a wonderful ensemble called Misagio Galore in Ottawa. And I've been in correspondence with him, and so when I heard inspiration or influence, what came to mind is I want to try to do a sound poem. So, but I don't want to suggest that I'm the one who's influencing myself here. Oh, and the other thing that I want to say is, as part of the game, what I did is I took the poem that I wrote for George and just redistributed the spaces. So it's exactly the same poem, but turned into a sound poem by virtue of the conversations I've had with John. Has no title yet, or has no title. Thispa sibit enker taint thesis ede re tobia ve info. Why therefore to pass Zion tomi su reiko mona gain sets and sto ole ap erad ax cor doniden a dis kid to falmig teethed etwem igthi arthin thek omid yinth in sui tos forage rementen detil reset Hymia, Shuria, Blia, Curacy, O Fief. So, one of the things I learned from John, I couldn't understand during our correspondence why they needed hundreds of hours of practice in order to get the sound poems to work in ensemble, and I did learn this week why that's the case. So this is exactly the same poem, rearranged the way I wrote it for George. It's called I Pursi Mauvais, and it's written in the memory of the composer Franz Kamen. The space between certainties is a dare to behave in full with a first passion to measure a commonage in sets and stops, to whole a paradox cordoned in a disquiet of almighties, that we might then hear the comedy in the suitors for agreement, and the eldresses the immeasurable accuracy of if. Thanks.
Wow, isn't this crazy? This is just wild. I love this. I said to George before we started, I'm Jim Moore, and I said, you know, it's been years since I've seen these people who are really my community. They're really my world, but we're all such sort of solitary, quirky types and go our own way, and here we all are. I said it's like going to a funeral, but nobody's died. You know? Maybe a little. Yeah. So when I was a young man, actually, let's just say a kid in graduate school 40-some years ago, at the University of Iowa in a Midwestern state. I had graduated from the University of Minnesota, also a Midwestern state. I'd grown up in Illinois. I was just a Midwestern guy. And I got there, and here were these people from all over the country, some of them from other countries, writing poems that had nothing to do with anything in my experience at all. And then one day, I came across a poem with the following prosaic title: Driving to Town Late to Mail a Letter, by somebody named Robert Bly. It is a cold and snowy night. The main street is deserted. The only things moving are swirls of snow. As I lift the mailbox door, I feel its cold iron. There is a privacy I love in this snowy night. Driving around, I will waste more time. That's 5 lines, by the way. Here's my 5-liner. Begins with the title is the first line. Midnight and the low sound of water from a stone fountain. His dog suddenly barking at us. An old man, vocal cords gone, puts his hand to his throat, whispers through his voice box, tomorrow he will be your friend for life.
All right. Hi, I'm Nora Poole. I'm actually George's niece. And I wanted to start out with a poem by Elizabeth Bishop, and I'll explain why afterwards. It's called Insomnia. The moon in the bureau mirror looks out 1,000,000 miles, and perhaps with pride at herself, but she never, never smiles. Far and away beyond sleep, or perhaps she's a daytime sleeper. By the universe deserted, she'd tell it to go to hell, and she'd find a body of water or a mirror on which to dwell. So wrap up care in a cobweb and drop it down the well, into that world inverted, where left is always right, where the shadows are really the body, where we stay awake all night, where the heavens are shallow as the sea is now deep, and you love me. And I picked that because Elizabeth Bishop writes about northern climates and the great wilderness of Canada and Massachusetts, and ever since I was little, George and Bev would take us camping, and it was just a great thing. And my poem was written in response to that. The young. The young play games in autumn, throwing out arms in flight, upward towards trees with gem-like leaves, rust, yellow, falling only to gather what's left in their arms, holding on for another year to let aching wings arch and flex through the fractal autumn light.
My name is Jim Perlman, and the roads were open today, so I drove down from Duluth. And I wanted to thank George for this beautiful book and to tell you that your love for us has made us better people. I was born and raised in Minneapolis and attended Southwest High School, where Art Froehle was my English teacher. And he, along with Sarah Sexton, introduced me to the world of poetry. And one of my favorite poems from that time is by Lawrence Ferlinghetti, from A Coney Island of the Mind, which was one of the first books of contemporary poetry I read at the time. So this is called Constantly Risking Absurdity, number 15. constantly risking absurdity and death whenever he performs above the heads of his audience, the poet, like an acrobat, climbs on rhyme to a high wire of his own making and balancing on I-beams above a sea of faces, paces his way to the other side of day, performing entre-chats and sleight-of-foot tricks and other high theatrics, and all without mistaking anything for what it may not be. For he's the super realist who must perforce perceive taught truth before the taking of each stance or step in a supposed advance toward that still higher perch where beauty stands and waits with gravity to start her death-defying leap, and he, a little Charlie Chaplin man who may or may not catch her fair eternal form, spread-eagled in the empty air of existence. I'd like to share my shortest poem here. It goes by pretty quickly. Thank you. Thin soup. This old man slips, hands shaking slowly into his soup. Thank you.
To paraphrase a familiar cliche from my upbringing, rising, giving honor to George. He asked me to do something that is very out of character for me. I even have a poem with a line in it that says, I write long poems because I have a lot to say. But I took George's challenge and I'm very grateful for it. Now I have started my own manuscript called Quintets, which will be 50 poems of 5 lines of my own, thanks to George. I also want to thank the Loft because, as a lot of you may remember, I was on staff here for 9 years, and in those 9 years, I met a lot of writers and was influenced by a lot of writers, and some of those writers I will mention tonight. Just last weekend, I was honored to share a stage with Amity Baraka at the Southern, just down the street, and we read and performed an adaptation with music and dances of his Wise, 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 and actual chronology of slavery in poetry. But earlier, when I was in undergraduate school, I read a poem of his that actually showed me his softer side, called Preface to a 20-volume Suicide Note. Lately, I've become accustomed to the way the ground opens up and envelops me. Each time I go out to walk the dog, or the broad-edged, silly music the wind makes when I run for a bus. Things have come to that, and now each night I count the stars, and each night I get the same number, and when they will not come to be counted, I count the holes they leave. Nobody sings anymore. And then, last night, I tiptoed up to my daughter's room and heard her talking to someone. And when I opened the door, there was no one there, only she and on her knees, peeking into her own clasped hands. Another thing George did was to limit the lines and the time for this presentation, and I decided to divide the lines between two of my favorite writers. The next writer is Nathaniel Mackey, who's a brilliant poet, but I decided to read something from his fiction. This is China. A character named Aunt Nancy of the Mystic Horn Society in a novel by Nathaniel Mackey titled Debut Begustus Run told a story that I believe bears repeating here. The story which another character named Jarred Bottle christened Namesake Anecdote Number 1 went like this. Aunt Nancy went to see and hear Frank Wright's band. He's a band leader and saxophonist who was playing with his band one night in the New York Loft in the early 70s. Wright was in a blowing mood that night. The band came on with a tuneless, ultra-out wall of sound, no head, no recognizable structure, a raucous, free-for-all cacophony, which at times had the feeling of an assault. The first set went on that way, nonstop, for about an hour and 15 minutes. During the intermission, between sets, Aunt Nancy approached Wright and asked if he'd play a request. He said, yeah. What would you like to hear? She told him China, and he said, no problem. The second set, however, went just like the first, equally tuneless, equally nonstop, equally without a head or recognizable structure, coming nowhere near the melody of China. The one difference was about 45 minutes into the set, Wright let the tenor fall from his mouth and hang by its strap, cupped his hands in front of his mouth like a megaphone and yelled, China, China, China. He then took the tenor back into his mouth for another 20 or so no let-up minutes of squeaks, honks, moans, growls, and squeals. I got to know George through his next-door neighbors, the Copmans, and I'm so grateful for the affiliation. And since I gave him the poem, I've rewritten it. That's what I do. You have the documented copy in the book, so I don't need to read that. You can read that for yourself. This is the current draft. It's grown a quote from Quincy Troop that says, the old people speak of death frequently now, and a phrase from an old Negro spiritual that says, there's a leak in this old building, and my soul has got to move. My soul has got to move, yeah. My soul has got to move. There's a leak in this old building, and my soul has got to move to a building not made by hand. For, AKA, to have a place to live. To have a place to live, I've recreated the universe. I'm writing an afterlife in case the dominant culture over there thinks of me as an object. Without poetry, fiction, music, and art, I'd settle for this world, which made me sweat, dig, and lie for love. Thank you.
I'm John Rezmerski. And I'm just really grateful to be in the middle of all of this joy, you know. I mean, this is the enterprise that we've all been involved in for such a long time is the creation or observation of joy, or if we don't find it right away, find a way to search for it. And George, thank you for being an instrument of joy in my world. I remember the first time I met you was at one of those gatherings at a retreat of Poets in the Schools program, which I had gotten lucky enough to be taken into, and we'd have these weekend retreats once a year. And the poets and the teachers would gather together, and that's where I met a lot of the poets who are here tonight and have become old friends with. And from them I learned about a lot of you other poets who are not necessarily old friends, but I wish you were. And it was a truly wonderful experience, those weekends where we would do workshops together all day, and at night there would be a reading. And the poets and the teachers would all read poems, and that's where I first heard George read. But one of the most wonderful things about those weekends was that I learned not only a lot of different ways that poetry could be, but I learned a lot of what teachers do and how poets and teachers are kind of in the same business. And it made me think, as I was looking for a poem that I had learned from, of a poem by David Ignato, with whom I studied at the University of Kansas. And I first was in a modern poetry class with him, and he was talking about what goes on in modern poetry, and he read us this poem of his own that he had just published. And he said there are 4 key things going on here that go into a lot of poems. One is to talk about everyday life. Another is to make observations about things. A third, to confess what your true feelings are. And a fourth, to find a way to be what you want to be. And this poem is in 4 little sections that are examples of that. Notes for a Lecture by David Ignato. I will teach you to become American, my students. Take a turn at being enigmatic, to yourselves especially. You work at a job and write poetry at night. You write about working. Married, you write about love. I speak of kisses and mean quarrels. The kiss brings the quarrel to mind, differences for their own sakes. Did I ever think going to bed a woman beside me would be no more uplifting than a $5 raise? Since then, I've been uplifted in bed 100 times and but once raised in pay. And that once has not been forgotten. Take a broken whiskey bottle, set it on top of your head, and dance. You have a costume. You have meaning. I thought that was a good start at learning about poetry. And in those Poets in the School sessions, I learned a lot more and keep on learning things. And this little poem from the book is a couple of things that I've been learning, especially recently, that that there's wisdom in the body and in the customs of those we know. Dancing lessons, too. Boys dancing with old women learn bungling can be forgiven. Learn the warmth of other age, sensible to puppy heat. Learn to step without stumbling, to hold a partner steady without expectation. Next, graceful, grateful words, the history of civilization.
What I love about John's poem is that the first line reads, "Boys dancing with old women learn bungling." And you think, great. And then can be forgiven in the next line. And the poem takes on 65 new levels of meaning that quickly. And that's what poetry can do, and that's what amazes me. For those of you who like to count things, you may have counted the poems in this book and figured out there are 51 poems in this book. Because I want to put myself in there, so I did. I was, after all, the guy who made the book. So I'm going to read just my poem, and then I'm going to propose that what you do instead of my reading some poem about what influenced me, because you know that story, I'm going to let you stand up for 30 seconds and wiggle your bottoms a little bit before we finish the evening, if that sounds okay. So, Cross Lake at Dawn for Gloria and John Ruff. Dew settles on the weathered slats of 3 wooden chairs left near the shore. Rags of cool mist, white voices of those we have loved wander at their own pace above the polished water, away from us.
Tough act to follow. I'm John Ruff, and I'm Nora Poole's uncle. That's why I'm really here. I was a first-year teacher and got to come from Bloomington to a class that was organized for area teachers. It was called Poets and Teachers. And in the first half of that class, I got to see many of you who are here reading for the first time. And then in the second, after that, following in the new year, George taught a number of us how to work on writing our own poems. I met Mark Vinz that year, and Mark came to my school and did a residency. So this is a kind of a homecoming for me, and it feels very good. I've been kicked out of a lot of nice places, actually. I left Minnesota, I taught in Rome, I lived in Oregon, went to Washington, and living on the West Coast, you live in the great sunlight of William Stafford, who was very kind to me a number of times. In fact, he read the poem that I'm going to read to you, and then I got a chance to talk with him and told him how much I liked it, and I sent him a note once, and he sent me back his own typed version of the poem, which he said he liked too, but it took a long time to place it, but he kept believing in it. It's called Our Kind. Our mother knew our worth, not much. To her, success was not being noticed at all. If we can stay out of jail, she said, God will be proud of us. Not worth a row of pins, she said, when we looked at the album. Grandpa? Ridiculous. Her hearing was bad, and that was good. None of us ever says very much. She sent us forth equipped for our kind of world, a world of our betters. In a nation so strong, its greatest claim is no boast. Its leaders telling us all, be proud. But over their shoulders, God and our mother signaling ridiculous. William Stafford. I was so young when I wrote this poem that I actually dedicated it to him. I mean, you know, like he needed it. And I actually had the poem accepted at Tendro, which was a great thrill for me. And then it went out of business, and so it's just sort of it's been just laying there. And then George told me about this project, and I said, 5 poems, 5 lines. Well, it's about 18 lines. I know what I'll do. And so the book is wide because of this poem. A curious fact for William Stafford. Most people don't know where their water comes from, or where it goes, or how far. My grandfather built his own barn. His horse knew the way there. My father told stories about his father. I get that from him. I can tell my father loves me by the way he reads the paper and goes to bed. My mother and I stay up and talk. We both want to say just one more thing. Thank you, George.
If I may, I'm going to read something before even I introduce myself. Okay. Writing poems. You may not go hunting, my father. Waist high and set still in wet fields, dawn-swollen weeds brush my boots, and leather swells towards sounds of animals in their early rituals. While sunlight arrows through pines at shoulder level, I aim to the hearts of animals and enter their lives. Into the bear, sleep sluggish and lumbering through thickets, into leaping pheasants, the color of blood crystals, or into the elk nosing the bright air for hint of me. With wind-stalking edges of our hair, it would be easy after hunting to turn the gun toward human lives, or with a skinning knife to draw the wet red line of blood from the backs of dreaming children. But I am not in the woods. Feeling these things erupt, I have never been there, because my father is a doctor, and each autumn of shotgun wounds, his eyebrows knit and furious. He is furious. He would forbid guns and hunting. I am sitting at my oak desk, knowing that what I have said is false, and not false, because he never said anything about writing poems. My name is Phyllis Sloan, and yet another student of George Roberts. This poem was by George Roberts, and in 1976, he did The Blessing of Winter Rain. In 1976, I graduated high school. It was the bicentennial class of North High. I came out of high school, but what was rich my time there was we had someone entering North High School those years who I viewed as a poet in residence. And of course, being in high school, we all know those high school feelings. I was somewhere between Nikki Giovanni and Sonia Sanchez and George Roberts. But I did learn the power of voice and words and the selection of words expressing images always in poetry. And so it's rare, but we all have the opportunity tonight. George oftentimes gives things away. In 1996, none of us would be able to believe the price of this book. It was $1.50, okay? And he gives opportunities away. And this opportunity that we have tonight as 50 plus 1 is an amazing thing. He still hunts for his students. He will come down the street and around the corner and find you with an invitation. And it's an amazing thing that I don't take for granted. But tonight, I have a poem in the book. When I presented this poem to him as my 5 lines, I did not give it the dedication because I didn't want to look like the suck-up or the teacher's pet or that kind of thing. But my poem is called Teacher, and it was written for George Roberts. For years, I could not speak thoughts real, but wrote thoughts. Your eyes smiled reading them. Your tongue called it poetry.
Thank you, George. I'm really honored that you picked me to be in this book. I'm really honored to be here with everyone. It's moments like this when I feel someone made a terrible mistake. Maybe George knew some other poet named Richard or something, but I'm really glad to be here. And then, of course, George asked about bring a poem, one poem that inspired you to write. And God, I thought, there's no way I can do that. You know, I could. There's so many poets. You know, I remember all those in high school. Those I used to call them Penguin poets because Penguin published a little pocketbook edition. Some of you might know that, Wordsworth and Shelley. But I went to my bookshelf and looked at them. I thought, oh, wow, those are great poets. But then I came right to Pablo Neruda, and he was the one that always did it for me, and it was his language. So I'm going to read some of a poem, and I can't read it all. It's just a little too long. It's called First Travelings. When I first went to sea, I was inexhaustible. I was younger than the whole world. And on the seacoast there rose to receive me the endless tang of the universe. I had no sense that the world existed. My faith lay in a buried tower. I had found so many things in so little, in my own twilit discoveries, in the sighs of love, in roots, that I was the displaced one, the wanderer, the poor proprietor of my own skeleton. And I understood then that I was naked and that I had to dress myself. I had never thought seriously about shoes. I didn't speak any languages. The only book I could read was the book of myself. The only life I knew was my secret life. I had to fall back on things like clouds, on all the hats of the world, rivers, waiting rooms, doors, and names, so many names that simply learning them would have taken my whole sacred life. Everything was new to me. This whole planet was dying of sheer old age, but everything was opening for me to experience, to glimpse that lightning flash. And then my poem was actually excerpted from a longer poem, which, if you read it, it would be clear that I'm in dialogue with myself, and so that the young man in this first line of the poem is me. And it's titled Bone by Bone. I followed the young man, his strange mysteries, whispered in smoky rooms of hashish, and now he stands at my window, folds his arms across his chest, stares accusingly. Yes, I surrendered, bone by bone, tooth by tooth, mending clothes, preparing now for a far stranger journey. Thank you. Thank you, George.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Deborah Stone. Thank you, George, for inviting me to participate in this book. I really appreciate it. I also appreciate very much you finding a home for us at the Northside Writers Group for so many years. Thank you so much. The first poem I'm going to read is by my husband, Lowell Weber, who also impersonates Garrison Keillor. He wrote poems to me, wooing me and courting me for a whole year, and he inspires me to write poems because he wrote for a whole year to make me his wife. The name of his poem is called She Is. She is the glow of fond remembrance, the quiet evening spent beside the fire. She is the morning warmth of sunlit spring, the soft breeze of 1,000 miles of joy. She is the source of grand, unfailing truth, the elemental pulse of our shared world. She is the bold and scolding blast of wrath, the tender, playful, touching stroke of love. She is the garnered wisdom of the times, the well-tuned instrument of judgment and sound. She is the stylish, worldly, girly girl, the social weaver spinning of new friends. She is the inspiration of my poems, the one and only reader of my soul. She is. Thank you, Lowell. And my poem, included in the book, is called A Story. After the divorce, she married the young niece of her ex-husband. You know, the one they raised like a daughter. The ex-husband took up drink to mend his broken heart.
I'm either Mona Van Dyne or Mark Vinz. I'm not quite sure. Or John Vinz, as some people know me by. George finally got even. I published the book, The Blessing of Winter Rain, all those years ago, which was a joy and a way to get to know George. And I think the first time I got to know George was living in his house when I was doing a Poets in the Schools residency at my alma mater, Burlington Junior High. There used to be a magazine called Poets Who Haven't Moved to Minneapolis. Well, I grew up in Minneapolis, but now I've lived for many years in Moorhead, out on the far edge. And people like Phoebe especially, and Bill Holm, bless him, and there's so many of us living out there in the far reaches. And don't forget us, please. I was lucky. The first serious poetry reading I ever went to in my life was Langston Hughes. The first poet I ever read seriously was James Wright. And my mentor was a man named Thomas McGrath, one of my dearest friends. There is no doubt that the poem I have to read tonight is one of Tom. This is not one of his communist poems, but it's a poem about poems, and it's a poem about seeing, and I think that that's what poetry is all about. It's called The Trouble with the Times. And he originally wrote this poem for a friend of his named Naomi Raplansky back in the 40s. In this town, the shops are all the same. Bread, bullets, the usual flowers are sold. But no one has a shop for angels. No one sells orchid bread. No one a silver bullet to kill a king. No one in this town has heard of foxfire rosaries. Instead, they have catechisms of filthy shirts, and their God goes by on crutches in the stench of exhaust fumes and dirty stories. No one is opening, even on credit, a shop for the replacement of lost years. No one sells treasure maps. No one retails a poem at so much per love. No, it is necessary to go down to the river where the bums at evening assemble their histories like canceled stamps. There you may find, perhaps, the purple weather for nothing, the blue apples free, the reddest antelope coming down to drink at the river, given away, given away. Such a debt we owe this man in so many different ways. My little poem was originally 6 lines until George threatened me. And actually, it really helped, because I had a line I didn't need. Robert Bly used to talk about that. He said, that's the trouble with American poetry, you write your poem and this little hand comes out and adds 7 lines, Remember those? Anyway, it's called Bird Count. And I think, again, it's about those things we see and don't see and hear and don't hear. Scarcely September, and the leaves began to turn. Soon enough, the V's of geese, the huddling sparrows, siskins, chickadees, familiar friends, too easily ignored, their cries as fierce and stubborn as our own. Thanks.
I think I'm the last reader. In fact, I know I am. George, you had a vision. And perhaps you had a vision as a high school teacher, too. Maybe, especially, teachers have to have visions. If you don't have the vision, you can't continue the job. You can't continue the nurturing of all those students, some of whom we've heard tonight. And then you had the vision of Homewood Studios. What a wonderful, wonderful place. I remember the first time I was there for a show and just being so astounded at the beauty of it. And then years later, to get the invitation, which was a piece of art in itself. Those of us who received them remember how beautifully printed it was. And what a joy to open that envelope and find that invitation for the vision, to be part of the vision. And now, here is the book. And as part of the vision of the book, someone suggested to you maybe they could help hand set the type. I did, because when you said it would be hand set, I said, I used to do that in another life. Maybe I could come and set my own poem. And because you're always willing to enlarge the vision, you said, sure, maybe other poets would like to come and set their own poems. And so we were able to do that. And what a joy, because there is nothing like hand-set type and poetry. It makes you value so much each letter, each word, each space, each breath. What a wonderful experience. So I can't imagine what vision you'll have next. But thank you so much for this one. Oh, I've been sitting here tonight thinking, Theodore Rutke, I love Theodore Rutke, and William Stafford, but then I've also been thinking, I've been influenced and mentored by all of you who have written the poems that have touched my heart, that I have taken into my heart. And so to think of one is very, very difficult. But I come back again, and I know he's been mentioned previously, but I come back to Robert Bly, the photo, light around the body, because it wasn't just the poetry. I think what Robert also gave those of us who lived here was also a sense of how one could live as a poet. You didn't have to be in New York. You didn't have to be on the West Coast. You could come back and live on a farm in southwestern Minnesota and raise children and have animals and live a fairly normal, quote, life and be a very significant poet. So this is a poem of Robert's that I've always loved, Looking into a Face. Conversation brings us so close, opening the surfs of the body, bringing fish up near the sun, and stiffening the backbones of the sea. I have wandered in a face for hours, passing through dark fires. I have risen to a body not yet born, existing like a light around the body, through which the body moves like a sliding moon. And my poem, The History of Rain. On pebbles, on rock outcrop, pink wild rose, and lupine, on buttercup, where she walks. The lake fills, rises, climbs the beach, chickadee notes, and water kissing. She'll never be able to figure that out. Thank you.
These are all the poets that we have to thank.